My chance new girl watch made in China. We play ping pong ball made in China.
Hello and welcome to China Econ Talk. I'm your host George Schneider here today with Christopher Balding, a Bloomberg opinion contributor and longtime Shenzhen resident. So before we jump into today's topic, which is U.S.-China trade and kind of the game theory and strategic dimensions of U.S. policy towards trying to open up the Chinese market, first I just want to hear a bit about your China story. So what first brought you to the mainland?
Well, what first brought me to the mainland was quite honestly my wife's work. My wife was a architect for rock stars in Beverly Hills. And in true China fashion, she got headhunted to come to Beijing. And it was one of those stories where she literally got a call on Wednesday and said, "We need you to start Monday morning. So take the first plane to Beijing and here's a big pile of money." And she showed up and she calls me and she's like, "What have I done? What have I gotten myself into?"
And you were married at this point?
We were married at this point, yes. And so I actually followed her a couple of days later. And so she's going to client meetings and everything like that. And she comes back one day and she's like, "Oh my gosh, for lunch we had filleted duck heads." Okay. And just, they throw you in the deep end with an anvil. And so that was basically the story. And then a couple of years later, after I received my PhD, PKU in Shenzhen offered me a job. And I, to be honest, thought I would stay probably, 3 years. And 9 years later, I'm still here.
So can we talk a little bit about, how you feel like you've gotten to know the country, particularly, with language limitations and how the onion has unfolded looking at these macro and finance issues over time?
I think one of the things personally is that because I arrived in China really not knowing anything about China, to be quite frank, is that I had to develop my China expertise, and I never even set out to become what term is China expert. And so to this day, I actually speak very little Chinese. In the first couple of years I was here, I actually tried very hard to speak Chinese. And if you know anything about learning the Chinese language, you learn that it is a very tonal language. And when we talk about Chinese being a tonal language, it's not like people speaking English with a different accent. It's not like English and Mexicans and Indians and Frenchmen speaking English with a different accent. It is truly that people don't understand a word you're saying if you don't have the tone exactly right. And so for about 2 years, the first 2 years I was here, I actually had a private Chinese tutor that I would work with 3 times a week, and I would try to do that. And so what actually caused me to stop was I had built up quite a bank of words that I knew in Chinese. And one day I get into a cab and I'm trying to tell the cab driver where I want to go. And he's just staring at me like, "I'm sorry, I have no idea what you're talking about." And this goes on for a couple of minutes. And at this point, I'm about to reach across the divider and just start wailing on this guy. And I said, "I've got to stop learning Chinese because it's clearly just never going to happen for me, or otherwise I'm going to get kicked out for beating up a cab driver." And so at that point I said, "Okay, I'm done. I'm not trying." And it was one of those things that I think ultimately benefited my long-term ability to understand China, because it's kind of like the blind guy that has to develop other senses. It's kind of like the deaf guy that has to develop other senses. And so what became, I think, really my strength in being able to study China is China relies a lot of things that are unspoken. How do you read between the lines? How do you read body language? Things like that. And so I had to do that. And this is especially true of data, is just, I threw myself into understanding what's going on inside the Chinese economy. And I wasn't able to read, Chinese newspapers and things like that. I wasn't able to talk to a lot of people. So I just had to go with, the tools at my disposal. And so it was one of those things that it was a weakness, and it was able to turn it around and in a way make it a strength.
Yeah, so it's you kind of acknowledge where you're at, and then do the Jim Chanos thing and just look at the numbers and see where they take you.
Yes, exactly.
So let's talk a little bit about your media diet today. What do you really enjoy reading? What in particular do you try to stay away from when you're trying to follow these sorts of issues?
So basically, I try to stay up. I try to read the things that, other people are reading, but I also think that I think there's a lot of interesting, when I first got to China, there really was, I think, a stunning lack of information depth on China. And I say that not because I had any special expertise when I first arrived here, but there just really wasn't that much written about the Chinese economy. Now it's progressed so that you actually have dedicated blogs on, the Chinese tech scene and podcasts on the Chinese tech scene. And you have things that are focusing on the Chinese metals industry and things like that. And so there's really been a flowering of really specialized things that really give you much more insight than, on specialized areas that are things that I think really form the foundation of what we think of as the Chinese economy. There's a couple of people that do very specialized things on the metals industry, steel, aluminum, tin, aluminum type of stuff. There's people that do podcasts on, down in the Shenzhen tech startup scene. An ex-student of mine that now works for, that now does startup grind underneath Google Ventures, a guy by the name of Jan Schmeckel, that does a lot of interesting things about that whole area. There's even people that are now focusing just on Chinese AI type stuff. So I think there's also people like Anne Stevenson Yang, who does a lot of research on Chinese banks in the financial sector. And so really there's been such a flowering over the past, say, 5 years of people that do, let's say, a little bit more niche type of things, but they really give you such astounding detail into what's going on in specific sectors of the Chinese economy, that you really get a lot more information than you would if you just said, and I don't mean to disparage any of these organizations, but like the FT or Bloomberg specifically, because they're doing very specific things and they do podcasts, they do different things that are really very narrow focused things, but they provide such enormous wealth of information on those sectors.
Sure. So you mentioned aluminum and steel. And even though this was the first foray that Trump took, one of your central arguments in these recent blog posts is that how it's really not about these metals and mining and anti-dumping stuff, but it's a more but the root of the current trade conflicts is really a more broad a challenge to the international economic order that China is making and the U.S. is trying to push back up against. So I want to walk through that in a pretty systematic way. And I think the first premise that you really need to establish is that whether or not China is a closed market. So let's have you make that pitch for us.
So I actually just finished up a book chapter for someone on is China a market or non-market economy. And basically, I think there's three different layers that I would look at this. One of them, probably the most common way that people look at this, is they say, well, the number of state-owned enterprises, for instance, has declined in recent history. They use various very clear metrics like that, and I don't think that's a reasonable, the correct way to look at it. So if we look at just, for instance, the number of SOEs, yes, it is accurate to say that the number of SOEs has declined. But if we look at, for instance, the share of financing, for instance, that these companies are absorbing, there was a great picture in the FT today about the percentage of new loans that are going to SOEs, and it's an overwhelming share. Another way to look at this is many so-called private companies actually have the state in some capacity as a controlling shareholder. One of the things that most people don't realize is that when they say we're looking at state-owned enterprise activity, that's just a corporate classification, like an LLC or a C Corp or something like that. An SOE does not specifically reference what is the level of stakeholding that the state has. It's just a corporate classification. So if we actually look at companies and what percentage the state owns, we actually have an enormous number of them. Practically, if you exclude companies like Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, which do not have officially a controlling state shareholder, probably virtually all large Chinese companies have the state somewhere in their shareholding structure as the controlling shareholder. It will typically go through, let's say, anywhere from 2 to 6 layers before you find what is the state entity that does that. But you will quite typically find that the state is a controlling shareholder. The other thing that I think is very important to note is that in countries outside of China, we typically think of the regulator as essentially creating the rules of the game that market participants play and compete within a specific market. Okay. In China, the regulator actually does not do that. They do engage in that activity, but they also go well beyond that. They set industrial output targets. They set, okay, this company can have this region of within China. They engage in a lot more activity that is specifically saying these are the outputs. This is who's going to control it. This is the price. If we look at it as a simple example, coal, steel, some of these hard numbers, some of these hard industries, what we actually see is that the regulator is specifying, what is the output? What is the output of the firm? What is the price that the firm is going to sell at? When can they actually operate? Okay, these are not just, hey, these are the rules of the game that you can go compete on. These are, essentially the Soviet Union almost 5-year plan of how much you're going to produce this year, how much you're going to produce next year, what is the price that you're going to sell at. It is in many regards that, especially in the primary and secondary sectors, it is a state-controlled economy where Beijing is dictating to firms how much and at what price they're going to produce at, and more importantly, projecting forward into the future, what they are going to invest in, how they are going to invest, and where they are going to invest. And so this is very clearly a state-controlled economy.
Okay. Strong first point there. Let's push back a little bit. So, that may be the case, but there also have been a lot of changes since, 1982 or 3 or whatever. So put those into perspective, and why should we not be giving credence to the line that the party says, which is that, look at all our flowering, tech industries and our vibrant free market of, venture capitalists and had this just been all government control over the past, there are Chinese characteristics to the socialism, right? So what's wrong with their line?
So the basic thrust that they take is they say, well, look, our banks are listed, our banks compete for capital, things like that. And in fact, if by most standards, most Chinese banks are considered private because they are listed on the stock exchange. They are some type of an LLC. They are not technically SOEs. Okay. But if we actually, even if we just look at the 5 major banks in China, which are responsible for probably at this point 55% of deposits in China, what you see is that all of these companies are owned by a company called Weijin Investment, which is owned by the Chinese Investment Corporation, which is owned by the Ministry of Finance. Okay, so all of these companies are owned essentially by the Ministry of Finance. Okay, and what is unique, and to circle back to something I said earlier about the role of the regulator, is the regulator is essentially overseen by a branch of, I forget the exact committee, but it's the central group, which is controlled by the Ministry of Finance. So the Ministry of Finance actually owns the banks and oversees the regulator that regulates the banks. Okay, that is not the type of relationship that says the regulator and the Ministry of Finance are taking an independent role to say we're going to let these banks compete on and say you guys have to slug it out. We just set the rules of the game. Okay, and so that's why you see in some industries, the regulator will go as far as saying this is how much your firm can produce this year, and this is the price that you produce it at. That is not a market economy. Just because, and this is one of the even if we look at VCs, in VCs, what you typically see is that right now everyone talks about the size of the VC industry. State-controlled VCs in China control basically $1 trillion of assets under management. Okay. So VC industry in China is basically state controlled. Okay? Just because it's VC doesn't mean it's free. It's competing in a marketplace. Just because a bank is listed doesn't mean it's not controlled by the government.
Sure.
And so we need to distinguish between those two areas.
So another key point, aside from the state control of companies, is the aspect of China as a closed market. So could you talk about that and lay that case out for us?
Sure. So one of the areas that I think has frustrated foreign investors and let's say companies that want to export to China or just try and get a piece of the Chinese market is the level of how closed the market is. Really, the bigger barrier for a lot of companies is investment barriers. China right now actually maintains a long list of what they call the negatives industries. Okay, and these are industries that are classified as either foreigners are free to invest in the industry, they're discouraged, or they're completely prohibited from investing. Okay? And so when we talk about this negatives list, we're not talking about laser-guided missiles as on this list. Okay, we're talking just run-of-the-mill industries. For instance, dance troupes and art studios. Okay, we're talking an enormous range of just completely. There's no way. It's impossible to think of ways that this can be a national security risk. Okay. And so one of the things is in this area is that a lot of companies are either prohibited from investing in these industries or they are forced into JVs. Okay. So one of the things is China argues that, well, we don't force technology transfer. Okay. And there is no law in China that says foreign companies are required to commit their technology into the Chinese marketplace to make it available to Chinese partners. That's completely accurate. At the same time, it's completely inaccurate what Beijing regulators are saying. And here's how it works. If you are a company that wants to enter the Chinese market, your product either faces, for instance, a 25% tariff, okay, 50% tariff, depending on the product. So you say, well, hey, I'm going to invest in China, and I'm going to build it that way so I don't have an export tariff to get into China. Okay, so then you say, well, I see that I can only be a minority partner. Well, if I want to sell a GM car into China and not face a 25% tariff, how do I do that? Well, I have to set up a manufacturing operation where I am the minority shareholder. Okay, well, if I'm going to sell a GM car in China, how do I sell a GM car in China without the GM technology? You can't do it, can you? Okay, so it's entirely accurate to say that there is no law requiring that. But if you're going to sell a GM car or really, any, a Mercedes car or just about, any number of products, you can't do it without transferring that technology to your Chinese partner.
So you've talked a little bit about this, but I want to push you more on the so what of this. Okay, SOEs control the market. Okay, it's sort of closed. But what's actually at stake that, in your opinion, is worth really starting a fight over these issues?
So I think one of the things is, and this is something that a lot of people I think are missing, is we think of this as, a lot of people have thought of this for quite some time as your standard industrial fight. And Trump has not done a good job on messaging and other things like that. But this is not your standard industrial fight. And the example I will use is for many years, the EU and the United States fought a battle for many years as to what constitutes unfair financial incentives for Airbus and Boeing. Okay, does the state of Washington providing tax incentives on workers hired to Boeing constitute an unfair advantage for Boeing? Does the EU guaranteeing financial loans to Airbus on development costs constitute an unfair financial advantage for Airbus? Most importantly, the United States and Europe said, we're going to litigate this dispute. We're going to litigate this dispute through the WTO. We're going to produce documents, and we're going to fight based upon an accepted set of rules. The problem with China, where there's a lot of frustration, I think, not just with the United States in Republican and Democratic circles, but in other countries in the world, is that China has essentially said, we're not going to fight by those rules. If you look at the best example being Visa and MasterCard, when China joined the WTO, they committed to opening up their payment and clearing system so that Visa and MasterCard could compete in China. They dragged their feet for many, many years. The Obama administration ultimately filed a WTO complaint that they were not living up to their obligations. They lost that in 2012, I believe. And 6 years later, we're still, looking at when is China going to open up its payment and settlement market. Supposedly, American Express might have received approval to do this. We don't know for sure yet. Visa and MasterCard still are not on the horizon. So this is nearly 20 years that China has supposedly been had an obligation to do this, and they haven't. One of the things that you hear from many companies is that they don't want to be the one to complain to their home government to file a case against China because they're scared of what will happen to them. And you hear the same thing from countries, that they don't want to challenge Beijing on their practices for fear of what will happen to their companies in China. And so one of the things is that what you're seeing is not just a standard industrial trade dispute where there's a dispute over subsidies or not subsidies, and we're going to litigate this at the WTO, but what are the rules of the game? How are these disputes going to be settled? And really, what is the future of the international trade and financial system?
Can you paint us, or just for all our listeners out there, if you haven't listened to Henry Gao's interview on China Econ Talk, this past episode, if you want a very different take on China's relationship with the WTO than what Chris is putting out there, be sure to check that episode out. So coming back to your idea that she's looking to create a different international economic order, could you paint us a quick picture of what that would look like and what sort of characteristics it would have that the current international structure currently doesn't?
So, excuse me. I think the place I would start is, how is China behaving domestically? And what you see domestically, and the data backs this up very clearly, is really a move towards re-centralization of the economy. You've definitely seen a move towards greater control over the economy. If we look at heavy industry, clearly this has been heavily tilted towards the SOEs in heavy industry. This is where the lending is going. If we look at even the tech sector, for instance, what you're seeing is China likes industries where there are one or two, maybe three dominant companies, and everybody else kind of works their way upwards underneath the umbrella that those companies provide. And even within the tech sector, you're seeing that type of industrial structure. The BATs, Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, are responsible for probably 60% of non-government, or I should say, of the unicorns in China. They're responsible for an enormous share of the VC funding in partnership with the state-owned VCs. So basically, what you're seeing is that the BATs are acting as essentially the chosen type of companies. So one of the things that is very concerning is, if we apply this type of model outside of China, how is China going to behave outside? It's probably very fair to say that it's probably going to project a very, very similar type of institutional structure outside of its own borders. It wants to see out internationally what it's seeing domestically. And if we take, for instance, the RMB and SDR as an example, the RMB is clearly not freely floating. It is tightly controlled on FX transactions. Okay, so what we are seeing is not a move to a more open international system, but is one where Beijing tries to act to control the international system to avoid conflicts. One of the things we hear is that Beijing has pressured countries to not file claims, to not bring disputes. And so if we say, how is Beijing going to act internationally? It's probably going to be along that type of model where it can control the price, the flow of products. We've seen that with the RMB. We've seen that in disputes. And I think that's what we would expect to see in the future.
Enter Trump. So, Trump's animosity towards China and Chinese trade practices is a long-standing one. We don't necessarily need to dive into the psychological backstory of that. But I think maybe starting from hiring Lighthizer in the formulation of a somewhat coherent strategy, if you want to take this story up to 2017, 2018.
So I think one of the things is that as I've talked to a variety of different people, one of the things that is very interesting is, and as you said, to leave aside many of the Trump issues that we could discuss infinitely, one of the things that is so interesting is that there are so many people that don't want to support Trump in his confrontation with Beijing, but they also recognize that Beijing has been a very unfair trader and has moved to become even more protectionist, if you can say that. People don't want to support Trump. They don't like the way he's going about it. They don't like the rhetoric. They don't like the brinksmanship. At the same time, they recognize that these issues with China need to be dealt with. And I think one of I've kind of defended Trump in some of the things I've written, and I would paint myself as very similar in that I don't want to support Trump. But if we look at some of the things, for instance, China has said things like, well, we're not going to negotiate with a gun held to our head, with blackmail. You've heard some of these terms thrown about. But one of the things that is so concerning is, and I think one of the reasons there is support for China, for Trump's, his confrontation with China and his receiving domestic political support is there are a lot of people in China that are in the United States that supported China over the years, that said, hey, we're bringing China into the international system, that we are trying to defend China's interest, that feel that China has taken advantage of their goodwill. China says we don't want to negotiate with a gun held to our head, but yet it's very difficult to think of a time within the past 20 years where China has negotiated, for instance, gradual opening of markets. I mean, after the WTO, it pretty much changed. And China has said, we're not going to negotiate. You look at, industrial examples like Google. And they basically said Google needs to basically censor and do our bidding, or they can leave the country. You look at the RMB situation about a decade ago, and it was basically China telling people to, this is not going to change. And we could think of any number of examples. And so part of what has driven it to this situation is that China has so steadfastly refused to gradually open its markets, gradually change things in very demonstrable ways. That's brought it where there is this, let's say, distaste, but willingness to accept Trump's confrontation with China.
Yeah. So one of the lines in your pieces says that since 1990, almost no democratic leader from a developed country has made a sustained effort of challenging Beijing, and virtually all, even the great moral signalers, have sprung from even the most tepid of challenges. And concoction of various factors, whether that be optimism at economic development leading to liberalization, the promise of opportunities in China markets, exports making things cheaper, what have you, has really staved off any real confrontation for almost going on 30 years now. I guess once the post-Tiananmen sanctions were lifted, it was kind of ready, set, go since then. So one of the interesting concepts you bring up is this like VORP, wins against replacement idea, in that Trump really being outside of the bands of what you would expect a mainstream Republican or mainstream Democrat president to take from a tactical perspective in going about this sort of confrontation. It's hard to say whether it's going to be a win or a loss yet, so we can't really put a VORP number on it. But if you could walk through the strategy and why it. Oop, that's okay.
Sorry about that.
No. Hello. Okay. So if you can talk a little bit about how Trump has differed in his approach from your average American politician, and the costs and potential benefits of this type of negotiating.
So one of the things is that Trump has taken a decidedly confrontationalist and rhetorically heated approach to China. I mean, and on a slight caveat, I will say within the past couple of weeks, maybe month or so, you've definitely seen a little bit tighter running of the ship, but it's still a very confrontationalist approach. And this definitely, I think, even by Republican standards or Democratic standards, falls well outside the mainstream. Whether Republican or Democrat, for many years, you had the Clintons, you had the Bush, you had the Obama team, which were, very decidedly, I think, relatively pro-China. Even if they acknowledged some of the problems, there was definitely much more willingness to defend China and try and bring China into the system and promote trade and things like that. And so one of the things that I think is important to look at is that Trump is doing a lot of decidedly non-mainstream things and how he's going about dealing with China. But I think one of the issues that is kind of being lost a little bit in all of this discussion is there's structural issues at play. And so baseball statisticians, if I can digress briefly, baseball statisticians have come up with this idea of what they call wins above replacement. If I signed another professional baseball player to replace somebody on my roster, how many wins above replacement does my current player provide me? Okay, how many plus or minus wins above replacement over the course of a season? And so one of the things that I think is based upon the current mood in China, economically and things like that. One of the things is that even though Trump has taken a very confrontational approach, it's very, very difficult for me to see how, if we replace Trump with almost any reasonable politician that we could think of, take Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, Mitt Romney, whoever you wanted to, it's very, very difficult for me to see how Trump is much different from zero wins above replacement as a president. And I say that primarily not pro-Trump, but in the sense of I don't think China is in the mood right now to change for anybody. Even if Trump did everything right, filed it with the WTO, negotiated in good faith, in a non-confrontationalist approach, it's very difficult for me to see how China is going to make any real concession for anyone, because they have laid out, this is our strategic plan of what we're going to do, and if you don't like it, you can deal with the consequences. Again, if we look at how they've behaved domestically, on economics, on business, on finance, it has not been a pattern of measured negotiation. It is Beijing saying this is how things are going to be done, and if you don't like it, we're going to start throwing people in jail. So it's very difficult for me to see how Trump is going to vary much from, let's say, zero presidential wins above replacement.
So what's interesting is this is the same this is the sort of same tack that he's taken with North Korea. And there, what he's really doing is like opening up the cone of potential possibilities and like increasing. Maybe the winds will be up, maybe the winds will be down, but really the variance and the uncertainty is what's going up. And what's scary about the North Korea stuff is, for a while, the Doomsday clock ticked a little closer. But basically what you're saying is that There's no such real thing as like a U.S.-China economic doomsday clock. And the kind of downside risks of taking this more aggressive stance won't actually matter all that much from a U.S. economic health, global international economic order perspective.
From if you look at some of the estimates that have been done, just to give you an example, so Trump is let's take the 50 billion that we're talking about initially. 50 billion in a nearly $20 trillion economy is, yes, there will be specific firms, there will be specific, people that are very affected in the macroeconomic picture.
Just not getting more expensive whiskey. But sorry.
No, exactly.
Let's not minimize. Let's not minimize the impact on Americans who like their imports living here in China. But sorry, please continue.
Well, my favorite, some of the things I was reviewing the tariff list, and I think China slapped tariffs on U.S. made durian, and I don't even know where.
So there's actually a great Planet Money podcast that investigated this very thing, and they called the 3 people who farm durian in the U.S. And you would not be surprised to learn that they're all in Puerto Rico. And they, because it's like a tropical fruit, right? There aren't a lot of places you can grow it. And the reporter calls up the durian farmer and goes, so like, do we export any durian to China? And the guy just cracks up. And it's like, the last time, this is so far away, like there are probably even laws against it. So the idea,
do they import?
No.
They don't
there's no durian export. There's no durian export to the U.S. So the idea is that, or the hypothesis of, I think it was Brad Smith, the Peterson guy, was saying that they just probably had like a list of all the fruits and some Excel file and like copy pasted it. Not necessarily seeing, because, right now the number is 0, the amount of imports, and, like hawthorn, all these other fruits that like are not quite a thing in the U.S.
If tell me, because I also saw there that China was placing tariffs on U.S. produced flamethrowers. Any insight into that situation?
I think we're gonna have to find some flamethrower creators. Maybe our next episode we'll talk to them about their export troubles. But sorry. So to get back to the downside risk of the 50 billion.
And so I think one of the things is, and one of the very interesting things. I think it was the Rhodium Group that produced a piece that maybe the best solution for the U.S.-China trade relationship is to, they almost use this Gwyneth Paltrow term of conscious uncoupling, that maybe there needs to be some separation in the supply chains and things like that. And one of the things that I think you're seeing is especially in a lot of the industries where that's easily feasible. Let's say garments, textiles, a lot of basic manufacturing, things like that. You're already hearing firms saying, well, maybe I need to move some of my production back to Mexico or Vietnam or something like that. Because I think there is a very sustained risk that, for the foreseeable future, and I'm not just talking the next, say, 3 months, I'm talking, maybe next, 3 to 10 years, we're looking at a period where Chinese-U.S. trade relations will become such that firms need to very actively manage their, let's say, political risk of, am I producing for the U.S. market? Am I producing for the Chinese market? And one of the things is that as I mentioned a little bit earlier, that these investment barriers are much bigger issues than the trade barriers specifically, is economic theory tells us that, firms will invest in a country if the market is big enough for me to justify operations. Okay. So I'm not going to start a plant in Luxembourg so I can, serve the Luxembourg market. Okay. I am going to start a plant in the Chinese market to serve the Chinese market. Okay. And that's exactly what we've seen. We've seen companies, U.S. companies say, I'm going to start a Chinese plant so I can serve that. I'm going to set up as Pizza Hut, marketing staff so I can understand the Chinese market to serve that. And so one of the things is that you very, very easily could be looking at, a period over the next couple of years where firms have to say, hey, I need to, do this for the Chinese market. I need to do this for the U.S. market, and come up with very, very distinct strategies based upon that political risk.
So, is this a bad thing for the world? If we end up with these kind of two independent, supply chains, economies, I mean, is this, is this going to make World War I more likely, World War III more likely to happen, or what do you think are the kind of like broader takeaways aside from the loss of trade efficiency, the 0.5% loss in economic efficiency that the world is going to face?
My own personal sense is that the world is moving in the direction where, for lack of a better term, and this might not be the most appropriate historical analogy, but I think you're moving almost more towards a Cold War type of system. You've seen definitely somewhat of a, let's say, a little bit of a warming of relations between Russia and China. You've definitely seen, for instance, there were just recently missiles placed in the South China Sea. Some of these types of things, which, it's not crazy to think that that you're entering a little bit more of, that type of system where countries are going to treat each other very differently. We always took for many years the system as a given in the sense of everybody agrees on the values that we have and want to promote in the countries that were really, let's say, the major powers of the world. Germany's, your France's, et cetera. And then post 1989, there was even this thought that Russia was going to join this system. In the past couple of years, let's say the past 5 years, I think you've seen people begin to think, wow, this might not be going in, just everybody's going to sing Kumbaya and agree on the rules of human governance at a country level and at an international level. And it's not crazy to think that you're at the beginning stages of, a little bit more of a bipolar system where maybe you have the United States, and some of the liberal democracies with China and Russia and some of the more authoritarian states saying, no, these are our visions of how the world should be. And that's not a pleasant thought. And I don't think that's something anyone relishes, but that's not a crazy look at how the world might be over the next, few years.
So, with that negative note, let's try to paint the picture of the positive outcome. So, can you walk us through what would happen in the Chinese bureaucracy, and what would happen if, for whatever reason, the Trump pressure works out?
What I am hopeful is a plausible settlement. So I don't know if everyone has seen the documents that the U.S. side supposedly asked for and what the Chinese side supposedly asked for. My take on what the U.S. side asked for is they basically said, this is everything we want. I mean, realistically, it was pretty reasonable in, everything that they were saying, this is what we want, are based on valid complaints. They're clearly not going to get everything they want. They just said, since we're asking, we might as well ask for everything we want. The Chinese side, to be honest, I thought the Chinese asks were more unreasonable in the sense that, look, fact of the matter is, Chinese tech companies are never going to be able to bid for government procurement. Okay.
Yeah.
The U.S. government is never going to let ZTE bid for government server projects. Okay. It's never going to happen. I'm hoping that somewhere there can be some plausible alternatives. And I think there's actually a lot of space for that. And what I mean by that is, look, I understand China is not going to give up 2025. Okay. That's fine. I think that's a very reasonable, that's not entirely unreasonable from the Chinese side. They have to commit to some market opening on their side, in the investment market, in the trade market. And I think probably the biggest concern of the Trump administration is not that China signs a deal, but that they actually follow through, because there's been so many deals where China has not actually executed what they say they're going to execute. So if China just even says, we're going to commit to this relatively limited market opening in a couple of areas, and we actually follow through on it, I think that would change the tone and tenor of the entire relationship with the United States, with Europe, with Japan. And I strongly suspect, and they haven't said as much, but I think one of the reasons Trump is pushing for specific deficit reduction target is not the economic theory of it, but that is a very observable metric to say we can tell that China's living up to its end of the bargain. Okay? If China commits to ending this specific, let's say, non-tariff barrier, there's 10 other non-tariff barriers that they can roll out that will have the same ultimate effect. A deficit reduction target, there's a very observable, quantifiable metric to say, is Beijing living up to their target? All this is to say, I think if Beijing took some very verifiable, hard steps to say, we're going to do this, and they actually did it, I think that would totally change the tone and tenor of the conversation. From the U.S. side, I think what is most likely going to happen is they're going to end a lot of the tariff threats. They're going to roll back a lot of the steel and aluminum tariffs that not just the Trump administration rolled out, but the Obama administration rolled out. Because in fairness to the Chinese side, China is quite clearly not dumping steel and aluminum and similar type of products because prices are so elevated right now. When Obama was originally rolling those out, there was a very good argument for that. Anymore, there's not. And I think that's probably a very good alternative where the Trump administration agrees to roll back a lot of things. China actually takes verifiable steps to open up the Chinese market somewhat, even if they don't give on 2025.
So a few points on that. First, I think you're being a little too generous. Just in the Trump focusing on the trade deficit thing. I mean, maybe it surely has this like ancillary aspect of, okay, this is something that international trade is very easy to get data on and track, but is a number, and he's been focusing on this number for 30 years now. So this is not like something that Lighthizer whispered into his ear, saying that this is the one we're going to want to hammer home. I
think that's completely fair. I think it is one of those ancillary benefits, and it is clearly something Trump has been focused on. I mean, somebody sent me a YouTube clip from like 20 or 30 years ago where he was banging on about the U.S. trade deficit. It wasn't with China at the time, but it was the U.S. trade deficit. And I think the benefit of it now is that and you've heard them say things.
It just happens to line up.
It happens to line up. Yes, exactly. It happens to line up.
The clock is striking midnight. The other thing, which I think is going to be an interesting dynamic, if they do get into some sort of positive, a positive cycle of liberalization, is I would be very surprised if Trump could get Congress to do anything from a market opening standpoint. I mean, this is maybe there are some executive stuff you can roll back, but I don't think Republicans are stupid enough to push a China liberalization legislative agenda with the bloodbath that's about to happen in 18 months in the midterm. So the chips that are actually on Trump's side in terms of, I mean, there's the CFIUS is about to get strengthened. There's I think very little momentum at all for a rollback in the sort of investment restrictions that the Chinese side is looking for.
Well, so on the investment restriction side, you're entirely right. You are 100% right. The good thing though, in a lot of stuff, there's a lot of executive action that Trump can take. On the various dumping measures, on some of the elevated tariffs that he implemented, that Obama implemented. There's a lot that he can do there. On the investment strategy, absolutely not. And in fairness, that is an issue. It's not just Republicans. There is actually a lot of Democratic support. One of the issues with like ZTE and Huawei, for instance, is the U.S. government has never really tipped its hands as to why they've maintained this position for so long, but it has been so bipartisan for so long that I'm inclined to accept that when the Obama administration says no, this is a national security issue, and Trump says it, that it's probably not just your run-of-the-mill protectionism, for lack of a better term, that there's actually something going on there.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, I was taking the Democrats not being in favor for this as a given. But there's certainly certainly going to be tough, a tough hill to climb on that end.
And the last thing about that is that, and this is one of the things, is that if Trump ever got his act together, even on the Democratic side, there would be widespread support to take a much more tougher stance with China. So, and that's one of the things, is probably the biggest mistake that Trump has made is Republican or Democrat, American or German, UK, Australian, whatever. There is such a well of support to take a tougher stance with China that if Trump ever does get his act together and actually appoint someone to be a congressional international liaison, I think it will really surprise China how deep the support is to take a tougher stance with China.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really remarkable, just looking in the past 30 years of American history, is how long this kind of elite consensus has been able to override concerns in actual America about jobs getting taken away and other economic threat that China's been posing. I mean, the fact that this consensus has lasted so long is probably even more surprising than the fact that there's finally a president that's broken through and decided to tap on this sort of economic anxiety.
And I think one of the things that's so interesting is over the past couple of weeks, Trump's numbers, even with all the things about his problems with porn stars, his numbers have actually ticked up.
Yeah.
Can I say it's because of China? No, I can't. But is it reasonable to assume?
Well, I mean, it's Kanye. Let's be clear.
It's Kanye. It's Kanye. Can we say it's because of China? No, but that's probably not a crazy assumption. And a lot of it has to do with, there were parts of America that, had this China shock. I mean, and again, I don't want to overplay because I think competition is helpful. I think it was good for China. I think them entering the WTO was good. But one of the things is this is why there's this political base of support for Trump, even among a lot of Democrat, working rank and file Democrats, because he's actually taking on China.
Yeah.
Is it the way it should be done? Is there, is he doing it? Is he making a lot of mistakes along the way? Absolutely. Is there that base of support because he simply opted to take the fight? Absolutely. And so hopefully this will cause, even within the Trump administration, some saying, hey, how can we do this better?
Yeah, I mean, there was a real, the line for decades now has been, and I think like Obama copped up to this explicitly, saying, hey, I'm gonna beat you guys up, and I'm gonna beat China up in the campaign season, but things will be okay once I come into power. The calls from H.W. in H.W. Bush's memoir, post Tiananmen, talking about, look, we're gonna try to work through this, and we don't want the economic future of China to be imperiled just because of these political issues. I mean, this has been a real constant for a really long time, and Trump really has the gumption to kind of blow that consensus out of the water. And as you were saying, it was something that was building for sure. This was not. It was building, in the heartland, but also, within the halls of Massachusetts Avenue think tanks.
Yeah, and that's one of the things. And I sincerely hope China is not misreading the situation, because even among the people that were 5, 10, 20 years ago going to bat for China, saying this is we want to build this relationship, there's a real sense of look, they're totally playing hardball now, and they want nothing to do with how the rules of the game work. And yeah, I don't want to support Trump, but there is a part of me that says, yeah, he needs to do this.
So one of the big things you've been critical of the administration for is the messaging. And you say what makes this so inexplicable is that the White House can stand on facts. So earlier in this interview, you gave us the kind of economist's pitch of what's so important and what's a big deal about this. But I want you to play Sarah Sanders for a few minutes and give us the White House press secretary's pitch to the American people about why this is something worth paying more for T-shirts and shoes for.
So one of the things that I would do is people feel this in America very realistically. You have they always talk about a lot of the counties and states that carried Trump to victory were these people that were most affected by Chinese trade. Because one of the things that happens in international trade is that, especially in a country like the United States, you have fewer people doing low-wage manufacturing and more people doing higher value-added, computer, financial, tech, services like that. And so a lot of the people who were most impacted were, the companies in, the manufacturing, heartlands of Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Ohio, places like that. So one of the things that I if I was advising the Trump administration is they need to really get on their messaging of like, look, this is why we're doing this. It's not because we hate China. It's not because we want to keep China down, but make a pitch to the American people of, we want China to play by the rules of what the international economic system is. It's designed to promote free trade. It's designed to promote capital flows. It's designed to promote dispute resolution. Countries should feel free, whether it's the United States or whether it's Norway, that handed out a Nobel Prize and was scared to confront China when China, hit them with trade problems. Okay. We want that type of international system. They need to make that pitch to the American people. They need to make that pitch to China, and say, look, and I will say, to a little bit of degree with slightly defending the Trump administration, you've seen that as they were coming over to China, okay? I think it was Lightgeiser that said something effective, we don't want to change the economic system of China. We want it to become more open to international competition, okay? And they need to come up with better talking points, because it is understandable from the Chinese side that, the U.S. side has been spewing such, rhetoric about the China threat and other things like this. And Trump has said, tweeted out many times about China, that they need to take a more measured approach about what they want from China, how to work together, even if they are going to take a tougher approach.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like a bit of a catch-22 here, and in that we may not be able to. There may not be a world in which a president exists that's able to be super aggressive, but at the same time be organized. I don't know. I mean, I guess looking back in Reagan in the early years, the way he took on Japan leading up to the Plaza Accords, that's kind of like the model that you'd hope for in a sort of happy resolution. But at the end of the day, Japan was in our economic umbrella or in our security umbrella, and they didn't have too much of a choice and couldn't just like turn their back on us. But this is definitely not the case with China in 2018. So the managing of rhetoric with like really aggressive, hundreds of billions of dollars in tariffs is a really tricky game to play, because I also think like, in order to get the American people's support, like the tweets are half the battle, right? But the more you pour the fire on for the domestic audience, the harder it is for China to be okay finding a middle ground. So,
and what's so interesting to me, and this is to me the biggest mistake Trump has always made, is if he needs to appoint a domestic point person, he needs to appoint an international point person. And that domestic person needs to go to the Chamber of Commerce. And they need to say, look, this is what we want to work with you so that we have a strategy to go deal with your concerns to China. They need to go to the AFL-CIO and say, look, AFL-CIO, we know you have issues with China, okay? How can we get your support, and what are the issues we need to take to China to get your support? He needs to go to Chuck Schumer. He needs to get Paul Ryan. He needs to go down the list, the GEs of the world, all the way through to the small business guys, okay? Because you know what? All of those constituencies do have China frustrations, okay? He needs to appoint an international point person. He needs to call up Angela Merkel. Angela Merkel has expressed same concerns, okay? Theresa May in the UK, okay? I mean, go down the list of world leaders. They've had the same problems, okay? President Moon in South Korea with that. Okay, same issues. Okay, I guarantee you, if Trump says, I'm going to take a couple of months and I'm going to get all of these constituencies domestically and internationally to say, we're going to go talk to China and we're going to go over these in a systematic way, he will have enormous support.
Yeah, I mean, well, Maybe, but because Trump's, maybe not. I mean, this is the. I don't know if it's a tragedy, but this is the this is the crux of it.
And we might have unicorns and rainbows as well.
No, is on the one hand, we spoke earlier about he's the only guy in like the realm of possible presidents who is willing to take such an aggressive stand, but he's also probably the only one who would be doing it in as a boneheaded way as he has been. The variance cone could have been tilted to like a higher, certainly like a higher range of like positive possible outcomes. But because he is who he is, he's really shooting himself in the foot with a lot of the really important tactical things that you'd want to be doing in a much smarter way, going about this sort of high stakes.
And let me propose a scenario. I'm not about to say that this is the scenario. I'm not about to say it's happening or will happen. I'm saying one of the things, though, that I think is happening that might be a Trump strength is he's so unpredictable that the Chinese don't know what to do with him. Okay? The Chinese have always dealt with Goldman Sachs, Citibank, et cetera, bankers. They come over and they say, hey, we want to build this relationship and things keep moving forward. They make maybe some concessions and things just keep going. Because Trump is who Trump is, they don't know what to do with him, okay? And when I talk about presidential wins above replacement about Trump, the key thing I think to keep in mind is, let's assume you had somebody, Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, Mitt Romney, pick whoever you want. You're probably only raising the probability that you're going to get a good negotiated outcome from China very minimally, in my opinion. I don't think you're going to say, make up a number. Let's say Trump has a 25% chance of getting a good negotiated outcome. I don't think if Hillary Clinton or Mitt Romney, and I don't mean to criticize either of those people, but I don't think you're going to take your probability from 25% to 50%. I think you'd maybe take it from 25, maybe to 30, 35%.
Yeah.
But I don't think you're going to all of a sudden get a radically different outcome.
So on that note, I'm going to ask a selfish question. Yeah. So, as a prospective master's student shopping around for thesis topics, what do you think would be an interesting way to follow this story from an academic perspective over the next few years, and kind of what, as the former methods teacher, what would you propose to give this storyline an academic sheen?
So probably one of the things that I would look at is, and I'll back up and tell you a story. I was getting on a plane and I was sitting next to a guy from a large American company, and he was telling me how this was a couple years ago, how he was already starting to move some of his production around because China was already becoming expensive and the time delay and stuff like that. So he was moving some to Mexico, he was moving some to different parts of Asia. I suspect a lot of what we're actually seeing in the supposed tariff pain. And in the short term, let's say 3 to 6 months, you can expect pain. 12 months, you can expect pain. But one of the things I suspect you would be seeing is firms saying, hey, if China's going to have tariffs, I can move some of my manufacturing to Bangladesh, Vietnam, Mexico, wherever. What is the response of firms to these implementation of tariffs? Okay. Apple can't move. Okay, Foxconn is Foxconn. They employ, 250,000 people making iPhones. Okay, you can't move that facility. Okay, but there are a lot of firms that are probably on those lists that are saying, hey, I can relocate what I do. One of the things I would look at is how much of this is natural progression away from China. Textile and garments were leaving China. They've been leaving China for a while. Does a lot of this just get speeded up because of this? I would suspect so. And you could probably get a lot of good firm level data as to where production goes for a lot of these different things. That's one of the things is because you have a very clear, there are tariffs implemented. What was it before? What is it after? You probably need a couple of years in the rearview mirror to look at that. But you could, if you were looking at it now, if you're doing your thesis project now, one of the things you probably could look at is how much of that has been happening and match it to tariff lifts that were announced, because I guarantee you they probably, and I'm assuming they did. I know that this happened. Historians tell us that this happens, when these tariff lists have been announced historically, is they say, we want to essentially promote change. And so rather than hitting, for instance, Apple iPhones, which can't be moved really, how can we promote change so that it goes elsewhere?
Yeah.
If you look at some of like the multi-fiber agreement back in the mid to late 90s, what you actually saw were firms, trying to speed up that. And you actually even saw a secondary market so that, for instance, and I forget the exact story, it was something like a country couldn't produce ski down jackets, but they could produce vests. So what they did is they produced vests, somebody else produced zip-on sleeves, and so the country B would produce the sleeves, country A would produce the vest. They would ship them to country B. They'd get assembled in country B and shipped on.
Sure.
Okay. I would suspect you would probably be seeing a tariff list that would match that type of logic.
Cool. Got another one?
One of the things that I would suspect that would be very interesting to see is how does this change investment patterns? One of the things that you always see, there was a great piece on when Bo Xilai was arrested. How did this impact Chongqing listed companies or listed companies that were based in Chongqing? How is this impacting investment patterns? Chinese investors always talk from a stock market perspective. Always trade with the government. Okay, I would bet that you would be looking. Chinese investors are looking at this in the domestic stock market as okay. There's got to be a list of companies that are going to benefit from these tariffs. One of the things that we've seen is actually it actually pushed the price of aluminum higher. Okay, and this was actually very good for Chinese aluminum companies, which are still struggling from overcapacity, pretty thin profit margins, things like that. So how does this impact those companies? And then also, how does it impact Chinese investment overseas? Okay, and I'm talking in this realm in a lot more like outward direct investment type of stuff. The best and also for international investors in China, one of the things is when Reagan negotiated the voluntary export restraints with Japan, what that actually prompted is that actually prompted Japanese car companies to start investing in American automobile factories so that they didn't have the tariff. Now it actually worked out very well because of a number of reasons, primarily transport, other issues. U.S. automakers are already here. How is this going to impact, for instance, Chinese companies that are looking to go abroad?
Sure.
You haven't seen a lot of success in Chinese companies looking to go abroad. It's quite possible that this could prompt a lot more interest in Chinese companies going abroad and certain types of, as I talked about earlier, companies separating this is our U.S. strategy, this is our China strategy for our supply chain or manufacturing. Are international companies going to say, okay, I have to essentially separate my U.S. and my Chinese operations and prompt different both, let's say, FDI into China and FDI out of China?
Yeah. And even if you come up with a negative result, that's still a pretty interesting one. If these firms being not all that worried about these sorts of trends are figuring that they can kind of go along their merry way without too much trouble.
Absolutely. And one of the other things is there's always a wealth of interesting data issues in China. And one of the things is, for instance, that you've seen is people like, some of the Trump people were saying, well, there's what they call transshipment, where you would ship, let's say, Chinese aluminum to Mexico, and then from Mexico it would go to the United States labeled as Mexican aluminum. That's typically been, that's always going to exist, but that's typically been a pretty small portion of international trade. So it would be interesting to see, for instance, if you see spikes in, let's say, if drops in U.S. imports from China of this product, but then there's Chinese spikes in exports to Mexico, and then spikes in Mexican exports to the United States.
Sure.
Okay. That's typically been pretty small, but it's always interesting. And as you said, a negative result, because it's like, look, guys, this really isn't happening that much.
So with that homework, I will go back to my merry cave and dig up some fun data sets with that. But I just want to say thanks again for coming on the show. This was a real pleasure today.
Thanks for having me.